But topping our news tonight is the death of a rising country music star.
Over the last 50 years, country music has lost some of its most iconic voices. Johnny Cash in 2003, Merle Haggard to diabetes in 2016, John Denver in 1996 to a plane crash. But in 1989, we lost one of the greatest what-if careers in country music history. Today, we'll be talking about the life and times, untimely demise, and the career of the Kentucky Bluebird, Keith Whitley. This is Pioneering Country. Born on July 1st, 1954, Jackie Keith Whitley grew up in a small town in rural Kentucky named Sandy Hook. Not related. Anyway, he was born to Faye Ferguson, the editor of the Elliott County News, and Elmer Whitley, an electrician. Faye and Elmer also had 3 other children. Those were Randy, Dwight, and Mary. His mother was a multi-instrumentalist, and if you can't decipher what that word means, it means that she knows how to play a bunch of different instruments, guitar, banjo, all that fun jazz. It is Kentucky. And Keith was engulfed in music from the time that he was born until he eventually moved out, and we'll get to that here in a second. He began performing publicly at only the age of 4 and won his first award at the age of 6 at a local talent show. After this show, his father, Elmer, decided to buy him a guitar, and thanks to his mother's musical talent herself, she was able to help teach him how to play. Now, some would label Keith Whitley as a child prodigy, and they aren't wrong for saying so. Keith Whitley, before the age of 14, had already made his television and radio live performance debut. Some of those recordings are available for you to listen to, and I'll get to that later on. Oh, and a quick ad, he also started his first band before 14 years old with his older brother Dwight on the banjo. Never recorded anything, at least that we can listen to, that I'm aware of. I did some pretty deep research into it, but it's out there, or it was out there at one point. I'm sure that it's in some like television archive somewhere. But anyway, on to the rest of the story. Growing up in the heart of Appalachia, he grew up with a lot of bluegrass influence, just like a lot of the Appalachian artists of today. 2 of the biggest ones I can think of off the top of my head are Tyler Childers and Charles Wesley Godwin. Banjo, fiddle, hard to argue. Anyway, he grew up with musical influence from guys like Hank Williams, George Jones, Merle Haggard, and his favorite as a child, Lefty Frizzell. Dude, this kid's got great taste. Holy smokes. Anyway, by the time he was a sophomore in high school, he was dead set on following his icons into country music stardom. However, this was going to be difficult for him because he grew up in Kentucky, but also he grew up in the time without TikTok and social media, so he couldn't just post a 30-second song clip on the internet and instantly get a record deal for like millions of dollars. But he also grew up in Kentucky, so that meant that he had to play the local scene to get big first. And that means that he has to lean into his bluegrass roots. But that just quite wasn't where his honky-tonk heart was lying at the time. But at 14 years of age, at a talent show in Easel, Kentucky, I don't know, Easel, Kentucky, he would meet another 14-year-old country music legend in the making who grew up 30 minutes away from him. This would be Ricky Skaggs. Ricky Skaggs was born in Cordell, Kentucky in 1954, so they were the same age. And Ricky not only shared a musical talent with Keith, but he also shared a love for one specific band, the Stanley Brothers and the Clinch Mountain Boys. Now, let's go into a little bit of Carter and Ralph Stanley, the Stanley Brothers, because they do play a very large role in the life and career of Keith Whitley. Carter and Ralph Stanley Brothers were a famous bluegrass duo of the time that toured and played music with the Clinch Mountain Boys from 1946 to 1966. Their duo career was cut short due to the untimely and early death of the older brother, Carter, passing in 1966 due to, can you guess it? Cirrhosis. Tough way to go. That's a rough one. Okay. The duo would be inducted into the Bluegrass Hall of Fame in 1992. Keith and Ricky Skaggs would meet, hit it off almost instantly, not only of their aforementioned love of the Stanley Brothers together, but also because when they harmonized together, they would sound eerily similar to their idols, Carter and Ralph. The two would eventually start a bluegrass duo together and they would name themselves the East Kentucky Mountain Boys. They would release a bluegrass album in 1971 titled Second Generation Bluegrass. After creating their new bluegrass duo, Ricky and Keith would find themselves in 1970 headed to Fort Gay, West Virginia, not too far away from the hometown of Keith in Sandy Hook, about an hour, give or take some. And I guess this is today's traffic of an hour, probably a little longer back then, for a Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys show. But to the dismay of not only the club owner, all of the patrons, but also our two country music legends, Ralph was running late with the band. So, because Ricky's dad told him basically never go anywhere without your instruments because you never know when someone's going to give you the chance to play, the club owner did exactly that and gave the two 16-year-old boys a chance to prove themselves on the stage. When Ralph finally made it to the concert that he was scheduled to appear at, he walked in hearing the Stanley Brothers. An old record on the jukebox is what he thought. But when he turned, looked at the stage, and realized that it was our two 16-year-old country stars sounding just like the Stanley Brothers, he was befuddled and impressed. He later on went to say, quote, "They did the Stanley Brothers better than the Stanley Brothers," end quote. So what does he do? He hires the two high schoolers right there on the spot to be Clinch Mountain Boys. And Clinch Mountain Boys they were. The two would tour and record music with Ralph and the Clinch Mountain Boys, running the Bluegrass Festival circuit, nightclubs, and roadside beer joints. Sometime in 1972, Keith would leave the band for a short stint to go work on his own musical direction for a little while. But later, he returned in 1974 to be the lead singer and the guitarist of the Clinch Mountain Boys. Ricky would leave the band in 1974 as well and go off on his own musical career, which would land him a spot in the Bluegrass Hall of Fame in 2018, as well as the Country Music Hall of Fame the same year. And this is the end of our Ricky Skaggs, Keith Whitley crossover. Keith would ride with the Clinch Mountain Boys until 1977, where he would join J.D. Crowe in the New South, typically just referred to as J.D. Crowe, who obviously the star of the band makes a little bit of sense because that's who we hear sing. But at the same time, we could do like a reverse Southall, or do what Southall did and go from the Reed Southall band to just Southall. Just an over-encompassing name, because we don't really say Cody Johnson and the Rocking CJB. We say just Cody Johnson's playing. But I mean, you got to give credit where credit's due. So I can see an argument for either way. JD was a little more progressive when it came to bluegrass music and really gave Keith a little bit more creative freedom as a guitarist and a vocalist. J.D. Crowe was inducted into the Bluegrass Hall of Fame in 2003 for himself, and Keith would join to be the lead singer of the band, being allowed to express that honky-tonk sound he'd yearned to produce since he was a wee little lad. He would stay with the band until 1982, during which he was able to cut 2 full studio albums with the band, including Somewhere Between, which J.D. Crowe had produced specifically to show off the talents of Keith as a country singer, not just in the bluegrass space. So he finally let him really just put his honky-tonk and country vocals into it, and I don't blame him. Keith, now dead set on spreading that honky-tonk talent of his, moved to Nashville after leaving the New South and going solo. He'd get his chance when he signed with RCA Records in 1984. Also in 1984, he would release his first solo project out of Nashville, a 6-track EP titled A Hard Act to Follow. This EP did not receive a whole lot of attention. Well, I mean, what do they tell you growing up? If at first you don't succeed, put out an absolute banger of an LP as your debut studio album, or however it goes, because that's exactly what Keith did. Now you're probably a little confused, because I was doing research for this as well. What exactly is an EP? What's an LP? Here's what I understood from my research into it. So an EP, right, is an extended play. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but it does. I don't know. This can have anywhere from 3 to 6 songs, and LP stands for long play. Extended and long both mean the same thing, technically, so I don't know really what the difference is, but oh well. Today we just call them an album. and will have 7 or more songs. And if it has anything over, I think 17, it's considered a double album. I think is how they do that. It's like a Human from Cody Johnson. It's the second Cody Johnson reference today. Huh. It all has to do with vinyl sizes, these things. Actually, that thing there, that's a Hank Williams 5 album. Uh, but I mean, thanks to the '90s, we have with the CD, it doesn't really qualify as much anymore. Especially now that most music is digitally streamed on Apple Music or Spotify, or if you're weird, Amazon Music or Pandora or YouTube Music, which seems to be a little more reliable. Anyway, speaking of which, what do you use to listen to music? Do you use Spotify, Apple Music, one of the other options that I mentioned, or are you weird and use Sound, even weirder and use SoundCloud? Let me know down below. Back to the story. Keith would release his first full studio length album in 1985 titled LA to Miami. Not only does this album contain some of the most iconic songs of his career, but it also has his first top 10 singles, 3 of them. He's got 10 Feet Away, Homecoming 63, and Hard Livin'. The album also includes my personal favorite off the album, Miami, Miami. This album, however, wasn't really that hardcore honky tonk music that Keith wanted to make. It was overproduced, there were too many different instruments, and it just wasn't what he wanted. So he set his sights on his next project that would hit shelves in 1988. The album would be his breakout moment. Don't Close Your Eyes, co produced by Garth Fundis, not related to Garth Brooks to my knowledge, really highlighted his hardcore yet modern honky tonk sound. This album garnered with not one, not two, but 3 chart-topping singles with Don't Close Your Eyes, the title track written by Bob McDill, When You Say Nothing at All, written by Paul Overstreet and Don Schlitz, later made even more famous by Alison Krauss in the 90s, and my favorite off the album, and then lastly, I'm No Stranger to the Rain, written by Sonny Curtis and Ron Hellard. This album showed off his deep reverence for traditional honky tonk sound, as well as his unique ability to bend vocal or note bending vocal style, which he got from his bluegrass roots and his childhood icons like Lefty Frizzell and George Jones. His iconic baritone voice and expressive phrasing was able to portray those melancholy, devil may cry, and overall vulnerable feelings that are extremely well suited for the tones of love and heartache and longing that he is so well remembered for today. While he's extremely well known for his emotion filled music and singing abilities, he's also a star studded songwriter. Alongside veteran Nashville songwriters, he would pen hits like There's a New Kid in Town, which I covered in the Christmas episode, I Want My Rib Back, and lastly, Wherever You Are Tonight, some of his most iconic songwriting credits. Keith has 3 more official albums that aren't just greatest hits collection, but I'll give those to you in a second. We've got to get to a little more serious. In 1986, Keith, now in his early 30s, would start dating Lori Morgan, daughter of 50s country star and Hall of Famer George Morgan, and a singer herself. They would marry later on in that November, and Keith would adopt her daughter from her first marriage, Morgan. And before you ask, no, her name isn't Morgan Morgan. It's like Morgan Gladys, if I'm not mistaken. Keith and Lori would have a son of their own in 1987, Jesse. And Jesse Keith Whitley would go on to follow in his father's footsteps and be a singer-songwriter himself. Now we skip 2 years down the line to early May of 1989. Lori is about to go to Alaska for a promotional tour for her upcoming debut album with RCA Records, Leave the Light On. Keith had gone to take her to the airport, and when he dropped her off, he gave her a card with a note in it. In just a week, Lori's album would drop, and in a few weeks, Keith was scheduled to be invited to join the Grand Ole Opry, a blessing every country artist dreams of. After Keith saw Lori off to Alaska at the Nashville airport, Keith slipped back into drinking. He had struggled with alcoholism since his teenage years, as touring musicians tend to, but he had cleaned up in 1987 with the birth of his son, the passing of his father Elmer, and multiple close calls with his own health due to drinking. On May 9th, 1989, Keith called his mother on the phone briefly. His brother-in-law, Lane Palmer, visited him in his home just outside Nashville. The two shared some coffee and talked about playing a round of golf and getting some lunch together later in the day. Lane left around 8:30 in the morning, and Keith planned to write some songs for him and Lori to record as duets when she returned home from Alaska. When Lane returned around 11 a.m. to go golfing and get lunch with Keith, he found Keith in bed. He was fully clothed, unconscious, and unresponsive. Black ribbons lined Music Row in Nashville in solemn remembrance as at 34 years old, the Kentucky Bluebird had flown to a new nest in the cloud. Keith's passing shocked the music industry and fans across the world. In August of the same year, his third solo studio album, I Wonder Do You Think of Me, would be the first album released by his estate posthumously. This album is said to have solidified his legacy as one of modern country music's most admired singers. It also garnered him 2 more number 1 singles in I Wonder Do You Think of Me, the title track, and It Ain't Nothin', giving him an unbroken streak of 5 number 1 singles. The album also featured the song I'm Over You, a post-breakup ballad about the rumors that may be swirling about how you're handling a breakup after the fact, and it's personally my favorite off the album. In 1990, RCA released a greatest hits album with 11 songs, including those 5 number 1 singles. In 1991, his 4th full-length studio album would be released. This one titled Kentucky Bluebird, where he gets his nickname. The second posthumously released album for Keith, it was a different blend of sound from his other albums and contains recording from his younger years as a child performer, interviews, and original songs that we had never heard of before. It was also the first album that had another artist to appear on a track during Keith's solo career. That one being Earl Thomas Connolly, who appears on 2 songs, Backbone Job and Brotherly Love. The final album we would see from the Kentucky Bluebird was in the year 2000. 11 years after his passing, Sad Songs and Waltzes would be released by RCA Records. This album features 14 original songs and 1 cover, and Keith had been sitting on these before his untimely and tragic passing 11 years prior. It's a quick side note, I don't think we realize how much music artists are sitting on top of. Like Zach Bryan, since 2019, I have this written here, has teased like so many songs, but has only put out 4 albums and 3 EPs since 2019, not including the individual single releases or like the times he's released songs multiple times, because they're like released as a singles pack and yada yada yada. But that's just a rant for another day. The songs of the album, Sad Songs and Waltzes, are basically that. It's a lot slower and very much match the name of the album. While the album may not have garnered Keith any new additional chart-topping singles, it did give us the song I've Always Been Honky Tonk Crazy, and the title track Sad Songs and Waltzes, which is a cover of a Willie Nelson song from 1973 off of the album Shotgun Willie. Over the course of his career, Keith would only receive 1 nomination for an award. This award would be 1986's Academy of Country Music Awards Best New Male Vocalist, which he would lose to Randy Travis. I can see why he lost, but at the same time, I'm kind of like, I don't know. I like Keith a lot, hence the episode, but Randy Travis does have a very iconic, like, low voice, so I can understand why. All other award nominations came after his passing in 1989. He was nominated for 4 Academy of Country Music Awards from 1989 to 92, and was nominated for a total of 6 Country Music Association Awards from 1989 to 1992, winning 2 of those nominations. One in 1989 for Single of the Year for I'm No Stranger to the Rain, and one in 1990 for Vocal Event of the Year, which was a duet with his widowed wife Lori for Till a Tear Becomes a Rose. He was also named the Academy of Country Music Awards Cliffy Stone Pioneer Award, which is for advancing popularity of country music, in 2013 alongside the band The Judds. Alongside his 2 CMA awards, he also has 2 RIAA certified gold albums with I Wonder Do You Think of Me and Super Hits, a compilation album from 96. 2 RIAA certified platinum albums in Greatest Hits from 1990 and Don't Close Your Eyes, 1 gold single with I'm No Stranger to the Rain, and 2 platinum singles with Don't Close Your Eyes and When You Say Nothing at All. I don't know how he doesn't have more, because Lord knows I've listened to Over You and Honky Tonk Crazy like 1,000 times in the last 6 months, but I don't know. I'm not part of the RIAA, so. Keith was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in the class of 2022, alongside Joe Galante and Jerry Lee Lewis, the two pictured here. With a professional music career that spanned about 19 years, a solo career that ran a short 5 years, 5 total studio albums, and 5 number one singles, Keith Whitley, despite his early and untimely death, left his mark on country music history. He gave us some of the most iconic heartache and longing songs of the 1980s and 90s, and not only that, he will continue to go down in country music history as one of the greatest gone too soon stories of all time. He was remembered in Ralph Stanley's memoir as saying, quote, "Nobody sounded like Keith. When you heard him on the radio, you knew who it was. If he had lived, he would have been one of the greatest singers Nashville ever saw. But he had something deep down inside him that wouldn't let him alone." End quote. He left behind influence for many country stars of the last 3 decades, like Kenny Chesney, Garth Brooks, Tim McGraw, Alan Jackson, Alison Krauss, Blake Shelton, Morgan Wallen, and many more. Thank you for joining me on Pioneering Country. I'll see you next time. Peace.